broadcasting from Netroots Nation 2016 in St. Louis, Missouri. And joining us now is Terrence Martin. Terrence is the Executive Vice President for the Detroit Federation of Teachers, so he operates at the intersection of a number of critical issues taking place in our society right now. So first of all, Terrence, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I got to ask you, you guys have been laboring there in Michigan for a long time under the emergency manager law that allows the governor to replace the elected officials of a city with, based on, as I understand it, his criteria, with appointed officials. And it seems to me that, first of all, an emergency only seems to exist in the mind of the Michigan governor when it's a fiscal emergency. It doesn't seem to be a children's health emergency, a children's education emergency, children's welfare emergency. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. I guess if I had the answer to that, we wouldn't have been under emergency management 13 out of the last 15 years. But you're absolutely right in terms of what's happening in DPS and the financial crisis that it faces, as well as the inability for the state of Michigan to take ownership over such crisis in DPS is absolutely absurd. However, when it comes to Flint, there's been absolutely a disregard to the folks in Flint and definitely a lack of urgency in terms of really doing what's right by the folks in Flint and by the folks in DPS.
You know, and when I think about the Detroit Public Schools and their funding issues, the city of Detroit and its funding issues, I lived in that area for a while. And, you know, one of the things that I think people don't realize, you talked about the state, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but kind of abdicating its responsibility in all of this. One of the things that occurs to me is a city like Detroit gets, quote unquote, blamed for financial problems. But if you look at the way business and money flows in an area like Detroit's, you had all this flight of money and jobs. People don't realize, if they haven't lived in Detroit or near Detroit, that all the money, all the jobs, and therefore all the tax revenue went right outside the city limits to form this kind of ring around the city. This is the way I think of it, and tell me if I'm wrong. And therefore all that potential revenue for something like the school system went with it, and now all of a sudden somehow the school district, the city government, it's as if the teachers are as if they're to blame for this broader economic exodus. Does that make any sense to you?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about a city that just maybe 15 years ago was in upwards to about 2 million people. And right now we're at about a little bit over 700,000. So there's a major decline in the population, and particularly due to the collapse of the auto industry. And, you know, when you lose jobs and people move out of the city, well, they tend to take their children with them.
Right.
So our school district at one point, when I first started back in the late 90s, we had 247,000 students, 241 school buildings. Now we're down to about 47,000 students and a little bit under 100 school buildings. So we've seen a constant decline. However, the state government has not helped us in that. Mm-hmm. With the influx of charter schools, with them lifting the ban on the amount of charter schools that could be open in our city. And what we have right now is we have parts of the city that are school deserts, where there is no high school or elementary school or middle school in the area. And then we have other areas of our city, our downtown and our midtown areas, you know, the places where you hear about stadiums being built and there being an influx of brand new folks in that area. They have more than the amount of schools they need in those areas. So there's been a disregard for the neighborhoods. There's been a disregard for the folks who have been in Detroit a very long time and have sacrificed and stayed even throughout this decline in enrollment and decline in population.
You know, and on top of that, you mentioned the charter schools, and we can get back to that because, I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize about charter schools, that they divert and drain money away from the public school system. And not only that, but a lot of times even a so-called non-profit charter school will have a contract with a for-profit company that reaps a lot of wealth out of the public school system and the federal grant, the federal funding and all that. So we could get into that a little bit more. But talking about Detroit schools, you know, there was a day, my mother was a teacher, and there was a day when being a teacher and being in the teachers union meant fighting for certain things, but among them was not fighting for the physical survival of your students. Yet you guys in Detroit, it's a perfect example. We live in a country that hasn't invested in its infrastructure, including its school infrastructure, for a long time. So as I understand it, you guys in the Detroit public schools are actually having to fight to get toxic mold removed from the schools. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And you know, the fight for teachers has definitely changed. Throughout this campaign, when we, you know, our membership really put, you know, out to the public that, look, you know, you talk about DPS, you talk about the struggles of the school district. Well, you're not, you know, you have no idea of what is happening within these schools. You have no idea about the conditions in which we're forced to work. And so when that was made public, it sort of gave a sense to folks that, look, we're not talking about getting anything extra here. We're talking about the basic needs of children and what they need to be educated. A clean and safe and healthy environment. A school that has heat. A school that doesn't have black mold and rodents running around. Right. Just the basic needs that teachers should have to educate students. And so when that was brought out, it really shed some light on what folks are really dealing with. But it was a time where, you know, we talked about books and supplies, and we talked about lowering class size, and we're talking about making sure that we choose a curriculum that best meets the needs of our students. But what our teachers and our members are having to face now is they've got to be politically savvy. You know, we got folks who, you know, because so much has happened to us legislatively, that we've had to educate ourselves on what happens in the legislature. We're being lobbyists now. We're writing letters, and we're tweeting, and we're Facebooking, and we're doing media now. And so the role of our membership and the role of teachers has definitely changed in Detroit. But it's all to preserve our school district. And why? Because we believe in it. We believe in the job that we're doing. We believe in Detroit. We believe in its revitalization. And we believe in our students and our school district. And so that's why we're fighting so hard. And it's not just us in this fight. It's been our community partners. It's been parents. It's been students that we've stood shoulder to shoulder and side by side with throughout this entire crisis.
Well, you know, and we're talking with Terrence Martin, who's the Executive Vice President of the Detroit Federation of Teachers. And, you know, how has that been for you? Because are you finding, for example, if you have to lobby at the State House and so on, is that turning out to be, do people understand, do legislators understand that, you know, somehow people don't realize that you don't go into teaching unless you're an idealist, right? You don't go into teaching unless you want to help and make a difference. You don't go into it for the money. You don't go into it for the perks, right? So do people realize when you go up there, do you get a friendly reception, especially from the Republicans, or do people just blow you off, or are they hostile, or how do they react when, because they're not giving you what you need, it seems to me?
Well, for the most part, I mean, it's been mixed, but in many instances, you know, we went into this with the understanding that, you know, many of the folks in Lansing, the lawmakers in Lansing who aren't familiar with Detroit, who've never been to Detroit and don't live in its surrounding areas, they just don't know. They didn't know. You know, they didn't know the issues that teachers had to deal with from day to day. They didn't know that it's not just educating children that we're concerned about. It's really caring for the whole child, from the child's home life to what happens in school. They didn't know that teachers were going in their own pockets and spending money for supplies.
Right.
They didn't know that teachers were taking second jobs because of all of the pay cuts that we've suffered in the past 10 to 15 years. They had no idea that these things were happening. So when we sent teachers, classroom teachers and social workers and school psychologists up to Lansing to meet with legislators, to meet with lawmakers and tell their stories, then that's what really changed things for us. We didn't get all the things that we wanted from the legislature. Obviously, money was a huge issue. Making sure that we had an elected school board was an issue. Among other things. We didn't get all those things. But what I think we were able to do was really change the image of the Detroit teacher, change the image of Detroit public schools, because these are folks, and I have the pleasure of representing the nearly 4,000 members who do more with less than anybody in the state.
I'm sure.
And I think that we were able to really sort of change the way that we were perceived in Lansing.
Well, good. Now, let me ask you this. What brings you, on behalf of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, here to Netroots Nation? This is a gathering of progressives, lefties, liberals, whatever you want to call them. Originally, as you know, started bloggers as a bunch of bloggers. What brings you here to St. Louis, to this group?
Well, I'm here first to say thank you to the bloggers, and to the Twitter universe and all the folks that Netroots touches throughout this country and abroad, because it was the social networking community that really assisted us and aided us in really bringing to light the issues of Detroit. I can't tell you the countless number of tweets of pictures of the deplorable conditions, so messages of upliftment, encouragement, folks who were very angry, and the vitriol that was aimed at Governor Snyder, whether it was a Move On petition or a Twitter storm. It was folks like that who care about education, who care about social justice issues, who recognize the fact that what was happening in Detroit and what was happening in Flint was rooted in racism, and those folks really stood up on our behalf and really helped us throughout this campaign. But I'm also here to tell the Detroit story. Everything that has happened in Detroit, can't be captured on film. It can't be captured just through a tweet. You need folks out here telling the story nationally, and hopefully this will prevent some other cities, urban areas, from going down, or from the things that have happened in Detroit, from happening to them. We say it all the time, it's Detroit today, Chicago, Philadelphia today, but it could be your city tomorrow. So hopefully from learning about Detroit and learning about our struggles and our fight back, that it would inspire people, that it will put people on notice, and that it will continue to inspire a movement that can spread throughout the country for working families.
I made that exact point, I think, when I've written about Detroit, and made exact point that Michigan, in a way, and the way it's treating Detroit and Flint and some other cities, mainly African American, is a kind of a laboratory. I look at that and I think, well, I look at that and say, if they get away with this in Detroit, in Flint, where I used to work, or some other places, that's going to be licensed, right? And if they fail, if we stop them there, we stop them everywhere. And so I do believe that, and we'll close with this, Terrence Martin. What is your next fight, and what's a Detroit Federation of Teachers' next goal or goals, and we'll close with that.
So I'll get back to just want to make one point. When you look at Detroit, this is the birth of the labor movement.
Absolutely,
this is the auto industry. This is UAW. This is Teamsters. This is the Detroit Federation of Teachers. I mean, this is the heart of the labor movement. And to suggest that Detroit is now a right-to-work state and that we're fighting for our lives in public education and dealing with so many races and social justice issues is unthinkable. But it's happening, and it's not only happening here, but it's happening throughout the country. And so you're absolutely right, as it being a sort of a test, litmus test here across the country, that if they can get this done in Detroit, if they can do that to Detroit, and they can do it to other places. So you're absolutely right on that. But where we're at moving forward is, we have what is probably the most important school board election that we've had in recent years. With the legislation that recently passed, it allows for a 7-member school board to run the new DPS school district in January. And so we are putting a lot of our efforts into making sure that the folks that are on that board are fair, are Detroiters who care about Detroit public schools, are folks who are going to do right by working families and students in Detroit, and people who are innovative and who aren't willing to go back to the same old. These are folks who are willing to do go above and beyond and do some creative things to bring Detroit public schools back to a day where our district was respected throughout the country.
Well said, and best of luck to you in your efforts. And Terrence Martin of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.